Great. Okay, good evening, welcome. It's wonderful to see everyone on such a cold evening. My name is Laura Heisler, and I'm the Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, the Director of Outreach for the Morgridge Institute for Research, and the Director of the Illuminating Discovery Hub for the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. So I have the privilege of working with all three organizations that are anchored here in this building that collaborate to bring you this Crossroads of Ideas series. And I am thrilled to say that even though we had intended to have this session in January and a session last month, we have been cursed with snow, but it's not snowing tonight. It may be arctically cold, but it's not snowing, so I'm so delighted that you could all make it. I've been crossing my fingers all day. We certainly appreciate you sticking with and having the patience as we rescheduled this session. I'm going to take just a moment to tell you about the rest of the sessions coming forward this semester, as well as just a few instructions for how this evening is going to go before reading a very brief bio to introduce our speaker. I do want to mention that I mentioned these three organizations combined to produce this series, which is really meant to be emblematic of the space that we're in, the town center, which is meant to be a crossroads of ideas across the campus and connecting the community with the campus on issues that are important to all of us and that happen to be the subject of groundbreaking research here at UW-Madison. Later this semester, so later this month actually, we are going to be bringing you the first of two sessions that feature research being done under the UW-WRF 2020 initiative, which is a bold initiative to foster cross-disciplinary, high-risk, high-reward research. So later this month, we will be hearing from Dr. Emily Stanley on her work in aquatic systems. And then in April, we're going to have the second of our rescheduled talks, if you've been following this series. Many of you might have heard about some important and controversial gene editing experiments that took place last fall in China. A lot of conversation about the CRISPR technology and gene editing. On this campus, we happen to have some of the world's foremost experts in the ethics and legal concerns and communications concerns around this technology, and they will be coming together on April 9th. And then finally, we'll be rounding out this semester with our second UW 2020 awardee, Youngmi Kim, on fake news. She was featured in the New York Times last year. So you won't want to miss any of these sessions. If you are on our mailing list, you'll hear about them. If you're not, we have a sign up outside and invite you to add yourself to the list. Just briefly in terms of this evening's session, Professor Brower will talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then there will be about a 10 or 15-minute question and answer period, so you're welcome to bring your questions forward. We ask that you raise your hand because we record these. You'll be able to find this recording in about a week or so, but if we capture your question on the mic, it's much better for the Q&A. So if you can wait, we'll have a couple of mic runners get a mic to you. We're going to end at 8. But Professor Brower has agreed to stick around and talk to people if you want to try and catch him afterwards with questions. So with that, I am delighted to welcome Marcus Brower, who is a professor in the Department of Psychology here at UW-Madison. Born and raised in Germany, he received his PhD from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and then worked for 17 years as a research scientist at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, the French counterpart to the National Science Foundation. He joined UW-Madison in 2011. As a social psychologist, he studies human social behavior and cognition and develops and tests interventions aimed at changing people's behaviors in a variety of domains, such as diversity, energy consumption, and workplace behaviors, to name a few. He's the author of more than 100 scientific articles and chapters and has obtained numerous grants and is a member of the editorial board of the top scientific journals in his field. And he is here to talk to us about something that was really timely on MLK Day, remains incredibly timely now, and we are so fortunate to have them. So please join me in welcoming Marcus Brower.
Thank you, Laura, for the introduction. I'm going to talk to you about scientifically tested methods to reduce racism and promote inclusivity. 52% of Hispanics and 71% of Blacks report that they're regularly or occasionally the target of discrimination. The same is true for 30% of whites. If you do the math, this is 130 million Americans who are concerned by this. Now, if you consider other discriminations like discrimination towards sexual minorities, towards women in technological fields, religious minorities. We're talking about a lot of people who are concerned by discrimination. Discrimination has a number of devastating consequences on mostly mental health, but also performance, and I want to focus here on the very last point. We now know that there is a direct causal path from being the target of discrimination to physical health. People are literally sick more often because they are the target of discrimination. There are, of course, many reasons why discrimination is completely unacceptable. It's immoral. It's simply immoral to treat somebody more negatively just because they belong to a particular social group. There are many other reasons which I've listed. I do want to point out here it's the costs that some people don't always realize. If you simply focus on the loss of talent that's due to discrimination causing people to drop out of educational settings, schools and universities, if you look at companies' turnover and number of sick days, if you then consider what discrimination contributes to everything that's related to crime and the legal system, from public defenders, judges, police, incarceration in jail and prisons. And finally, I just mentioned physical cost, the simple cost of discrimination with regard to health cost. We're talking about an enormous amount of money. Some studies suggest that things are getting better. People develop more positive attitudes towards outgroups. Other studies suggest the exact opposite, that things are actually getting worse. What you have here is the number of anti-Muslim assaults reported to the FBI. You have the 2001 peak, of course, but then you have a positive linear trend going up. Recent reports of number of hate groups that are increasing and that have reached their highest point in the last 2 years. So, given how incredibly important this problem is, and you might want to think that practitioners, chief diversity officers, social scientists, diversity scientists have come up with a large number of initiatives or of measures to reduce racism and to promote inclusivity. It is true, there are many, but there are multiple problems. Let me start out with problem number one. Most pro-diversity initiatives are not being evaluated. As a result, we do not know if they work. We do not know if they are effective. Let me give you an example. It was President Clinton's initiative on race. 20 years ago, a committee selected among literally hundreds of programs designed to promote racial reconciliation, the 124 most promising ones, the ones that looked the best among this pool of programs. Well, among these 124, less percent had been evaluated by outside evaluators, and only two out of the 124 there was a comparison between an intervention group and a control group. You're going to tell me, hey, that's 20 years ago. I'm sure things have changed. Well, things have not changed at all, even though we very much like the fact that Starbucks closes 8,000 of its stores to subject its employees to anti-bias training. We actually have no idea if this has any beneficial effect. First of all, we do not know that program that they implemented had not been evaluated before. And then Starbucks had no intentions whatsoever to evaluate the effectiveness of its training. Things have not changed. So it is surprising how many domains are out there where we expect evidence-based practices. We want our policies to be evaluated. We want our teaching practices to be evidence-based. Every energy efficiency program is evaluated in some sort of randomized controlled trials. And we certainly want our drugs to be tested in double-blind trials. But there's one domain where for some reason we don't care about evaluation, and that is the diversity domain. For some reason, we don't care if the stuff that we do works and has the desired effects. So I sometimes get the question, well, isn't it impossible to evaluate pro-diversity initiatives? And I always have the same answer. Of course it's possible. You can evaluate everything, and you can certainly evaluate pro-diversity initiatives. I want to give you an example of what we do. One of our studies here on campus, we design interventions aimed at creating an inclusive classroom climate with the hope that we will reduce the achievement gap in university classes. So when we design these interventions, I'm going to tell you about some of these interventions, but right now I want to tell you how we evaluate the effectiveness of these interventions. What we usually do is we recruit instructors who are willing to work with us. Then in the next step, we form pairs of classes that are relatively similar with regard to size, what level they are, maybe topic, whether they're STEM fields or not. And then we literally randomly assign, by tossing a coin, one class to the control condition and the other class in each pair to the intervention condition. Then we implement our intervention, and then we measure outcome. In our case, usually in week 12 of the semester. We have multiple outcomes. One of the things we do is we administer what is called a climate survey. We measure participants' perceptions of a variety of constructs related to intergroup perceptions and feelings towards other groups. So what we ask people is to report their feelings towards other group, the extent to which they support the university's diversity initiatives, whether when they witness discrimination, are they willing to confront it, and we ask them about how many cross-group friendships they have. Then we have a number of constructs, even though everybody responds to items related to these constructs, but we're going to be primarily looking at the responses of the students belonging to marginalized groups. And when I say marginalized groups, I talk about ethnic minorities on this campus, mostly African Americans and Hispanics. I talk about sexual minorities, members of the LGBTQ community, and finally religious minorities. And on this campus, that's primarily Jews and Muslims. So we're going to look at the responses of these marginalized students, and if our intervention is effective, we certainly would expect these students to report to us an increased sense of belonging, a more positive evaluation of the climate. We would expect them to be the target of discrimination less often, and we would hope that they would report better physical and mental health. But these are self-reports, and self-reports are traditionally unreliable. People sometimes self-present themselves in a favorable light. So what we really like, if we can, is to include what I call here consequential outcomes or hard outcomes. So what we would expect if our intervention is effective, we would expect our marginalized students to have better grades, and that should translate into a reduced achievement gap. We would expect fewer dropouts, fewer Fs in these classes. If we work with companies and organizations, we would expect minority employees to report fewer sick days, and we would expect a reduced turnover. And sometimes what we do is we actually go out and measure actual people's behaviors. Do they behave more inclusively? Do they discriminate less in the intervention condition than in the control condition? So this is what we do when we evaluate initiatives. And the point that I've tried to make, it is very possible to evaluate pro-diversity initiatives. That was problem number one. Problem number two, in recent years, there has been an increasing number of studies that have evaluated the effectiveness of pro-diversity initiatives. And it turns out that many of them are ineffective and some of them actually counterproductive. One person who is a leading researcher in that domain is Frank Dobbin. He's a sociologist at Harvard University. Frank's argument is, well, what happens in companies? And when a company introduces a particular pro-diversity initiative, we should be seeing changes. We should be seeing things get better after a number of years. So what Frank Dobbin looks at most of the time is what are the number of women and the number of minorities in leadership position 5 years after a particular pro-diversity initiative has been implemented in the company. Let me show you the results. In line 1, you have, for instance, mandatory diversity training. What happens 5 years later? 5 years later, you have 9% fewer black women who are managers, and you have about 5% fewer Asian men and Asian women in management positions. Other diversity initiatives are equally counterproductive. Standardized job tests and the introduction of grievance systems equally seem to have equally negative effects. If anything, what you observe is a decrease in the number of women and the number of ethnic minorities who are in leadership positions. A former graduate student here at the University of Wisconsin, Patrick Forscher, conducted a meta-analysis involving 492 studies and a total of 87,000 participants. He found that there was absolutely no effect of procedures aimed at changing people's implicit bias on discriminatory behavior or any kind of other behavior related to intergroup settings. The effect was zero. Let's talk a little more about implicit bias. It's usually measured with a test that is called the implicit association test. I don't know if you know what it is. The abbreviation is the IAT. It's I think in total 20 million people in the US have filled out this test. It measures people's associations between particular social groups in positive and negative traits or constructs. What it is that pictures of people, pictures of belonging to different social groups appear on the screen, and then positive and negative constructs as well. And by responding as fast as possible, this test measures people's automatic associations between particular social groups and positive and negative constructs. That score, as a result, you end up with a score, and that score is supposed to be an indicator of implicit bias. And the idea is you have these automatic associations, and when you interact with other people, when you read CVs, these automatic associations will influence your judgments, will influence your behavior without you being aware of it, and therefore will deteriorate relationships between members of different groups. That is the idea. Let's look at the data. We now have 4 publications on this topic. The 4 publications involve a total number of 140,000 participants. You look at the extent to which people's IAT scores are correlated with their behavior. You get a variety of results. 3 of these studies find a null effect. There is no correlation whatsoever between people's implicit association test scores and their behaviors. There's one study that suggests a small correlation of 0.14. I do want to point out that one of the co-authors on this paper is the researcher who initially developed the implicit association test. Even if you go with the correlation of 0.14 for the stats geeks among you, you're explaining 2% of the variance. If you want to predict somebody's discriminatory behavior, knowing that person's IAT score will allow you to predict 2% of the variability that exists in people's discriminatory behavior. That is very little. The word slowly gets out, and you now have more and more headlines in the newspaper. Can we really measure implicit bias? Well, we are relying on a flawed psychological test to fight racism, and then more explicitly, well, maybe mandatory implicit bias training is a bad idea. It doesn't work, it makes people angry, and it's seriously counterproductive. And there are studies suggesting that actually it does create negative feelings, and it is counterproductive. So this is surprising, this is stunning, and the question is, why is that the case? And I would argue that one of the major reasons why existing pro-diversity initiatives tend to be ineffective is we have not thought enough about who our target audience is. And when I say the word target audience, a technical term, if you think of behavioral interventions, behavioral campaigns, even though it's usually rolled out for everybody, the designers of the interventions usually have a small segment of the population in mind for whom that particular campaign is designed, and that segment of the population is called the target audience. And in order to illustrate that point, let me again talk to you about a study that we conducted in my research laboratory. We asked students here on campus. We asked everybody, but I'm reporting only the data from the racial minority students here on campus, and we asked them to divide their peers, the UW student body, into 6 groups. Let me present to you what these 6 groups are. Group 1 is students who have very negative attitudes towards other groups, and they engage in explicit forms of discrimination. Group 2 is people who have slightly negative attitudes. They engage in indirect forms of discrimination like social distancing, microaggressions, etc. Then there are people with middle-of-the-road attitudes and behaviors. They're not particularly discriminatory, but they also don't go out of their way to be particularly inclusive. And then we have people with relatively positive attitudes and some inclusive behaviors. And finally, we have people with very positive attitudes towards individuals from other groups and people who engage in many inclusive behaviors. And finally, then there's a group 6 of people who can't be put in any of these 5 categories. Here are the results. That's what our racial minority students on campus tell us, and we have 525. Of course, there's variability. There's a range from individuals with very positive behaviors, a lot of inclusive behaviors, to individuals with relatively negative behaviors and attitudes. Every intervention scientist, everybody who works on behavioral campaigns will tell you that your target audience should be this. These are the peoples where you have leverage, whose behaviors you can change. You will never change people who are on either extreme of the distribution. Some of the people are already doing the behavior that you want them to do. The target audience should be people who are in the middle, whose behaviors you can change. Guess who shows up for the typical voluntary diversity training workshop? These people, right? Not at all our target audience. So let me talk a little more about who our target audience is, because that is the university setting, but I think the same reasoning applies to other settings. And I want to introduce to you a hypothetical person, and that hypothetical person is Jeff. And what I'm trying to say is Jeff is sort of the prototypical member who we should be thinking about when we think about who our target audience is. Jeff's 54 years old. He doesn't have a college degree. He lives in a mostly rural and white area, and that's also where he grew up. Jeff doesn't hate black people or Hispanics or gay men, but he has ambivalent and slightly negative attitudes towards them. Maybe the most defining characteristic is that he feels uncomfortable talking to them. He doesn't know how to talk to them. He becomes fidgety when he interacts with them, and the technical term that we use is we call that intergroup anxiety. He experiences intergroup anxiety. And finally, maybe the most visible characteristic, that he engages repeatedly in behaviors that make members of marginalized groups feel unwelcome, not included, signals to them that they don't belong, signals to them that they're different from him and shouldn't be here in the situation, whatever it is, job, etc. Well, what else do we know about Jeff? He voted for Trump in 2016, but things are never black and white, right? Because Jeff also voted for Obama, like 13% of Trump voters. And well, let's have a closer look at these Obama voters. What you have here is not just white Obama voters who then voted for Trump. Let's look at all white Obama voters. And these are individuals who were sampled in 2011, December 2011, and then they were contacted later and they were asked who they voted for 11 months later. These are the agreement rates with the statements. About half of white Obama voters think that blacks should work their way up without any special favors. About a third of them rates Muslims on the less favorable side of a 0 to 100 favorability scale. Usually most people rate most groups between 80 and 100. Jeff also thinks that illegal immigrants are mostly a drain on society. And Jeff also thinks, hey, if blacks only tried a little harder, they could be just as well off as whites. What we have here is all white Obama voters. You can imagine what these percentages look like for Mitt Romney voters, right? Now imagine the following. I go to Jeff and I tell him, hey, Jeff, I know you are explicitly egalitarian, but I'm a researcher and therefore I know that you have these implicit biases. These are thoughts that you don't have conscious access to, but I know better than you know that you have these thoughts, and therefore let me fix you in a diversity training workshop. Jeff probably walks away, and if he doesn't walk away, he's going to say, Marcus, you don't understand. I have access to my thoughts and my feelings. This is what I think. I think that illegal immigrants are mostly a drain on society, and I'm more than willing to share that with you. I want to argue that we don't have a problem of implicit bias. We have a problem of explicit bias. Jeff has experienced some economic hardship. There is no doubt. Here's what happened to different income groups after the financial crisis of 2007. So if this is 0 at 2007, Jeff belongs to the second quintile from the bottom. There was clearly a decrease in family income, and it took nearly 8 years for Jeff to recover, right? There are others who suffered more, but he certainly saw that certain groups recovered faster than his income groups. What is also interesting is that Jeff thinks that whites are disadvantaged. And that is an interesting perception. Let's again look at some data. If you ask a variety of individuals whether or not they agree with the statement, average Americans have gotten less than they deserve, usually you get about half of the people who agree with that statement, that Americans have gotten less than they deserve. What is interesting is you then ask them, hey, what about blacks? Have blacks gotten less than they deserve? Some people generate exactly, have the same amount of agreement, whether it's average Americans or blacks. But that is not true for all groups. There are a variety of groups who agree considerably less with the statements that blacks have gotten less than they deserve. And this phenomenon has been incredibly well described by 3 political scientists. I put their book out there. It's an excellent analysis of the 2016 presidential election. They termed, they coined the term racialized economics. Racialized economics refers to the belief that undeserving groups are getting ahead while one's group is left behind. And they explained that that was one of the major driver of the result of the last presidential election. So, Jeff is a believer in racialized economics. Now I would argue the question is not whether I like Jeff or whether you like Jeff. The question is not whether I want to go on vacation with Jeff or you want to go on vacation. As a diversity scientist, as somebody who designs intervention, I'm asking myself one question. What can I say to Jeff? What can I show Jeff? What arguments can I put forward for Jeff so that Jeff will engage in fewer discriminatory behaviors and in a larger number of inclusive behaviors? And what I really care about is Jeff's behaviors, right? I want him to be more friendly, more welcoming, more inclusive to his colleagues. If he is a landlord, I want him to not discriminate against individuals belonging to ethnic groups. I want him to be welcoming to, I don't know, his children's significant others who happen to be members of marginalized groups. And if his daughter wants to marry a Muslim, I want Jeff to welcome that person into his family, right? I want Jeff to engage in a larger number of inclusive behaviors. And the question is, how can I do that? Well, let's look at one possible initiative, one way how one might go about doing that, and I'll let you judge how Jeff will react to that. You don't have audio.
I have deep racist biases. I have developed racist.
Let me start that again.
As a result of being raised as a white person in this society, I have a racist worldview. I have deep racist biases. I have developed racist patterns. And I have investments in the system of racism because it's served me really well. I think white fragility functions as a kind of white racial bullying, to be frank. We make it so miserable for people of color to talk to us about our inevitable and often unaware racist patterns that we cannot help develop from being socialized into a culture in which racism is the bedrock and the foundation.
We cannot help develop from being socialized into a culture in which racism is the bedrock and the foundation. The question is not whether you agree with that or whether I agree with that. The question is, how is Jeff going to react to that, and is that going to change Jeff's behavior? I can tell you right now, it will not. When Jeff hears that in a diversity training workshops, the shutters go down right there, and it doesn't matter what that person says afterwards and how many data that person is presenting regarding social injustice and existing power hierarchies. Jeff will not hear it. Okay, so this is the wrong way to change behaviors of members of our target audience. So now the question is, what does work? There are many things that work. I'm going to present 3 examples to you, and if you want to know more, you can talk to me later about others. I'm going to talk to you about a workshop that focuses on prejudice as a bad habit. I'm talking to you about norm-based interventions, and I'm going to talk to you about motivational interventions. The Prejudice Habit-Breaking Workshop has been developed by colleagues of mine here at the University of Wisconsin. The lead person is Dr. Patricia Devine. There are others, Molly Carnes, Jennifer Sheridan, Will Cox, et cetera, who have all worked on this workshop. The key idea is the following. Many of our behaviors are habits, and we habitually engage in behaviors that signal exclusion to others. Maybe they're even discriminatory, but we don't have the intention to do so. The format of that initiative is a workshop. And there are sort of 3 parts to the workshop. The first is, hey, the goal is to increase concern. The researchers or the workshop facilitator presents data, statistics showing that discrimination and exclusion continue to be persistent problems in our society. The second thing is about unintentional biases, about unintentional habits. Sometimes we engage in these behaviors, we habitually do things, and we signal to others that they don't belong, and sometimes we do not have the intention to do so. And then comes sort of the main part. The main message here is there are strategies that you can use. It's a bad habit. It's super hard to break bad habits. Once you have developed a bad habit, it's super hard to break that. But there are strategies that you can use to break these habits. But you should be aware that these strategies require persistent effort. You have to monitor your own behavior, and you have to go through life sort of very consciously thinking about what you do and how you talk and what you think. And here are a number of strategies that you can use trying to break your own bad habit. For instance, perspective taking. Every time you're in a situation like this, take the perspective of the other person, try to be more in contact with members who belong to a different group, focus on the individual characteristics of the person you interact with rather than the group characteristics. I'm not going to go into too much detail because you can just ask Dr. Patricia Devine for this, and she's happy to give a talk about this. I want to briefly present the evaluation, the effectiveness of this workshop. So this, what you have on the left, is the percentage of women among newly hired faculty before and after the workshop was administered. What you have before is the 3-year period before the workshop was administered, and half of the university departments at the University of Wisconsin were exposed to the workshop. The other half were not. There was no difference before the intervention. If you now look at the period 3 years after the workshop was administered, you find a 14% increase in the number of women among newly hired faculty. So real outcomes, real changes in who gets hired. Another study showed that participants who took part in the workshop were more likely to confront other people on social media. And one of the big things, this is a delayed effect that happened 2 years later, suggesting that the workshop has long-lasting effects and changes people's behavior in the intergroup domain. Norm-based intervention. A variety of researchers work on that. Betsy Levy-Paluk and my collaborators and I here at the university do a lot of work on norm-based interventions. The basic idea is that social norms have an incredibly powerful influence of behaviors, and we have all experienced once we moved to a new town or changed companies, in the new place, suddenly there are new norms, new behaviors are considered acceptable, and we change very fast our behaviors. We adopt incredibly fast. And if we can somehow change people's perceptions of what's normative, we can influence their behavior. It could be a diversity training workshop, but it doesn't have to be. It could be successful internal communication, internal newsletters, etc. Okay. So how do you change people's perceptions of social norms? One thing is through institutional signals. What you want is you want a public commitment by the top management to diversity, and you want visible efforts to remove institutional barriers. I just want to give you an example. I worked for many years with Michelin Tires, tire company out of France, but is 120,000 employees worldwide. I want to show you what Michelin Tires North America did. One of the things they did was a video with the CEO, and the CEO made 2 points incredibly clear. First of all, diversity is a core value of Michelin Tires. It's one of the fundamental values endorsed by Michelin Tires. And the second statement was, diversity is what allows Michelin Tires to achieve its business objective. The business objective is to make better tires, more safer tires, and cheaper. And these are the business objectives, and these business objectives will be reached better, more effectively through diversity. So diversity is one of the essential ways through which Michelin Tires can achieve its business objective. At the same time, they employed an external company that did something that's called CV testing. And I don't know if you've heard about that. What it is, it's an external company that creates CVs. They look different, they're slightly different, but they're judged to be of comparable quality. So you have 2 candidates that are sort of equally good. And what is different between the 2 CVs is one of them has a white name, and then another CV has a different name. In that case, a Muslim name. And then the external company sends these CVs to, let's say, Michelin Tires, and then the question is, many sets of two comparable CVs, and the question is there discrimination? Is there hiring discrimination? Michelin Tires asked an external company to do that. They identified the departments where there was hiring biases, communicated about that, did specific training, reviewed the hiring practices that were employed in each of these departments, employed the company again to do that same CV testing 3 years later, and then communicated about it internally within the company. That is a clear commitment to diversity. We try to identify where something goes wrong, we fix it, and then we test again whether what we fixed actually works. So, commitment to diversity by the top management, removing institutional barriers. Public commitment often takes place with statements that are on the web page. Some of these statements are more effective than others. What really doesn't work is our company does not discriminate. That means we have already achieved the end goal, and if there is an employee that claims being the target of discrimination, other people won't believe him. It's much better to formulate that as an aspiration. We're still working on this. This is the goal towards which we're striving. We haven't reached it yet, but we're striving with all our force and energy towards this goal. It's usually less effective to adopt what's called a colorblind perspective, where, hey, let's all focus on how similar we are, and it's better to adopt a multicultural perspective where people embrace their differences. So some of these institutional signals are more effective than others. There's another way how we can change people's perceptions of what is normative. You can communicate to people what their peers are doing. You can communicate to people that their peers enjoy diversity, have pro-diversity attitudes, and at least try to behave in an inclusive manner. The example I'm giving you here is the Campus Climate Survey, which was conducted on this campus in 2016. Look at the responses that we get. 80% of our respondents tell us that they very often or extremely often try to create a welcoming environment for other students here at UW. Nearly 80% tell us, hey, it's very important or extremely important to them that UW has a strong commitment to diversity. And many of them report that they spend often or at least sometimes time with students outside the class who belong to different ethnic groups. These are encouraging statistics, and if you remember the data that I showed you, the little curve, the bell-shaped curve that I showed you before, it's entirely consistent with what our racial minority students report to us. It's possible to report about these encouraging statistics while saying that discrimination continues to be a problem, but you can say, hey, most of your peers are actually trying to do the right thing, and if you are sort of distant towards other groups, you're a little bit an exception on this campus. This is exactly what we tried in this particular classroom intervention. In this case, we formed triplets of classes. We had in each triplet one class that was in the control group, no exposure whatsoever. We had a sort of comparison group that was another video. It was a video on bias and microaggressions. We did not expect that video to be effective. And then we had our social norms video, which I'm going to tell you about here in a second. So that was a... Huh? Yes, social norms video, 5-minute video that we showed to our students. So in that 5-minute video, what we had is we had half of the video was about young students telling us that they enjoy the diversity on campus, that they enjoy the fact that there are people belonging to different social groups, that they joined the multicultural learning community, that they work in labs that address diversity-related issues, and generally that they support the university's pro-diversity initiatives. The other half of the videos were researchers who reported about studies, just like the Campus Climate Survey, that suggest that a large number of students on this campus do hold positive pro-diversity attitudes, support the university's initiatives, generally try to behave in an inclusive way. Some of the researchers also mentioned that yes, discrimination is a problem. Yes, marginalized students on this campus are exposed to discrimination. Yes, that is unacceptable. But by large, most of the people are at least trying to do the right thing on this campus. Followed by a message, we value diversity and we embrace people from all backgrounds. Here are the results of this study. This is 12 weeks later in each of these classrooms. As a reminder, the social norms video where we talked about peers and what peers think about diversity is in blue, and then that video about bias and microaggression is in yellow. We have many outcomes. I'm focusing here on one. What do the marginalized students tell us? Sexual minorities, racial minorities, and religious minorities. 12 weeks later, these marginalized students tell us that the classroom climate is more positive. They report an enhanced sense of belonging. They report better physical health. And maybe most importantly for us, they tell us that their peers treat them in a more positive and a more respectful way, suggesting that there is a true behavior change in terms of how people treat each other, how students treat each other. Motivational interventions. People will make a very rational benefits-cost ratio analysis, and they will engage in the desirable behavior if that benefits-cost ratio for the desirable behavior is larger than the benefits-cost ratio for the undesirable behavior. And as a person who tries to change behaviors, you can leverage sort of two entities in this equation. You can either focus on the cost of the undesirable behavior, or you can focus or make salient the benefits of the desirable behavior. And that's actually done very often. There are campaigns about, hey, if you save the crabs, we get all sort of positive things. You eat right, you feel amazing, you're healthy, you have a better life, etc. We do that in many domains, but we don't do that in the diversity domain. In the diversity domain, we focus nearly uniquely on the cost of the undesirable behavior, usually with the finger, don't discriminate, this is all bad, and if you do this, this and this happens. We never focus on the benefits. And there are many benefits of behaving inclusively. Makes you a better person, you get to know new people, you learn how to think outside the box, etc. There's so many benefits that we can make salient. But we don't do that. Well, we tried to do that in one of our interventions, and the goal here is to make salient the perceived benefits for engaging in inclusive behavior. I again have a little video. It's a 5-minute video. It's a 30-second excerpt from this video.
It's incredibly important for our employees that we hire to have cultural competency.
We literally cannot do business and cannot work with in an environment unless you're sensitive to all types of cultural backgrounds.
We often hang around with the same people all the time, so it's very hard to break out of that cycle.
My advice would be experience as much as you can. The university is a plethora of opportunities to get involved with different diverse groups.
The responsibility principally lies with each of us as individuals.
I really encourage you, find someone that is so opposite of you and go ask questions, have a coffee with them. What happens in that exchange is magic, and it's lifelong. It'll change you.
What happens in this exchange is magic, and it's lifelong, and it will change you. Here are the results from that particular study where we evaluated, again, our new video with the CEOs against that bias video that I mentioned to you before. Again, we find positive effects, likelihood of confronting discrimination, belief that the institution supports the discrimination, and our marginalized students, again, tell us that they think that in classrooms in which we showed our CEO videos, the climate is more pleasant, more inclusive than in the other classrooms. There are just 3 that I mentioned to you. There are many others that I couldn't mention to you because I don't have the time to talk about that. Sometimes it's possible to use these interventions, these initiatives in combination. And when you do, you can achieve impressive effects. Let's look at what Harvey Mudd did in California. They were struggling with the fact that a small number of women received undergraduate degrees in computer science. They used a multi-method approach using some of the strategies that I just pointed out to you. What do you see 10 years later? You see a 520% increase in number of women who obtain undergraduate degrees in computer science. We can do it right. If we use diversity initiatives that work and work with people who actually evaluate in a systematic way, we can achieve very impressive results. Let me summarize some of the points I tried to make today. It is possible to evaluate pro-diversity interventions. The evidence for the effectiveness of implicit bias training is mixed at best, I would argue. I haven't talked too much about this fact, that could be another talk by itself. We really should be focusing on people changing people's behaviors. What's going on in people's heads is important, but the ultimate yardstick for an effective intervention is whether they change their behaviors. I think we should think hard about who our target audience is and what kind of messages that target audience will be receptive to. There's the Prejudice habit-breaking workshop, which looks really promising. I'm personally very excited about these normative approaches, changing people's perceptions of social norms. And I've told you about these motivational approaches where we focus on benefits and costs of different types of behaviors. So what can you do if you are an employee, if you are, have colleagues, or in your neighborhood? Well, very often people suggest interventions. Oh, we're going to implement this intervention. It's great. But one thing that you can ask, hey, this is wonderful, but can you tell me, has this been evaluated? I mean, is there any evidence that that works? I mean, is it going to have a positive effect or a negative effect? And I think that's very important to sort of promote that idea. We should really be working with pro-diversity initiatives that have been evaluated. What works in one setting doesn't necessarily work in a different setting. What works at the University of Wisconsin doesn't work at a lumber factory in Alabama, and that doesn't work in a high-tech company in Seattle. Whatever you do, it has to be adjusted to the local context. So if in your company there's an idea to roll out a pro-diversity initiative, my suggestions would be to test it first in a small scale, and then when it has been shown to be effective, then to roll it out on a large scale. Everybody always wants their family members to have the latest drug and to have a drug that works, but nobody wants to participate in double-blind studies where half of the patients end up in the placebo group. Well, if we never do double-blind studies with drugs, we will never improve our drugs. And the same thing applies to the diversity. Work with us. Work with us, develop and design evaluation studies. It's quite possible to randomly assign half of the departments, half of the units, half of the branches, half of the factories to the intervention condition, measure outcomes 12 months later, and then implement that same intervention, that same initiative in the other half of the units 12 months later. And if you don't know how to do it, work with us. We'd be happy to work with you and to help you evaluate your pro-diversity initiative. The research is overwhelming that diversity is an asset. It leads to more creative solutions, higher productivity, reduces costs. There are so many advantages to diversity. It's an incredibly important societal problem, as I've pointed out. On a personal scale, I think it's incredibly enriching. There are so many benefits that I derive. Most of the research ideas that I've had is talking to people who think differently from me, who come from different backgrounds. I find it fundamentally interesting, enjoyable to be talking to people who belong to different social groups. And I think it's possible that kind of enthusiasm to promote that in other people. But if we really, really care about reducing prejudice and promoting inclusivity, I think we should focus on initiatives that have been rigorously evaluated and that have been shown to be effective. Thank you very much. Questions, please wait for the mic and then talk into the mic.
You made a brief reference to this in your conclusions, but have you done any comparative quantitative analyses of the effectiveness of these programs in the university sector versus the public sector versus the private sector, or different operations within the private sector? Thanks.
We have not compared sectors. We have compared different types of initiatives within the same setting. For instance, one was that bias video about microaggressions. We didn't think it would work, and it didn't work. We are big defenders of focusing on a very particular setting. So usually when we enter a setting, when people ask us for advice, the first thing we do is we start with focus groups. We start with focus groups of individuals belonging to marginalized groups, and we ask them, tell us what the issues are. What are the kind of behaviors that are hurtful to you? What are the issues that hurt your feelings, that signal to you that you don't belong here, that decrease your sense of belonging? And at the same time, please tell us, what would you like to see more of? What are the kind of behaviors that you would like to experience more often, and then that would increase your sense of belonging? And then we do focus groups with individuals who do not belong to marginalized group, and we say, hey, these other guys, they just said this. How come you're not doing this more often? What are the barriers? What prevents you from engaging in these behaviors? Is it too difficult? Do you not have the opportunity? Do you experience intergroup anxiety? Please tell us what prevents you from engaging in these behaviors. And it actually turns out that different settings, the problems are very different. It's not easy to take one pro-diversity initiative that was developed for one setting and then without making any changes implement it in a different setting. And I'm always shocked about how some diversity training companies offer diversity training. It's the same training that's just offered to everybody, one size fits all, when in fact there are enormous differences from one setting to the next. There was one question in the back. There's a person's coming with a mic.
Thank you very much for the presentation this evening. It was just awesome. So I'm thinking of a particular division within UW-Madison who could probably benefit from your skills. And I'm wondering, how might that be set up? What would that look like?
Well, now you have to be explicit. What division are you talking about? Are you talking about the Chief Diversity Officer?
No, actually, I'm talking about a division, one of many within UW-Madison that I has struggled in this particular area. And
talk to me. I'd be happy to either give a talk, or I'd be happy to talk to the stakeholders to try to identify what the problems are. One of the first questions I'm probably going to ask you is, have you conducted a climate survey? Have people reported what the issues are? What are the issues we're actually struggling with? So sort of in the university setting, one of the third things is, who is actually causing the problem? Is it the instructors who are biased, who don't treat everybody in an inclusive way? Is it the peers? Does it happen in the classroom? Is it the group discussions, the classroom discussions? Does it happen outside the classroom? Does it happen in the dorms? Is it the staff? Is it the advisors? Is it at Union South, the people? So one of the first questions that I would ask is, I would try to identify the problem, and I would try to, who is it? And what behaviors do we want to change? Because I'm very focused on behaviors. And what I want to okay, tell me what behaviors are going to change, and then we're going to find out how we can go about changing these behaviors.
Awesome. And so I could follow up with you at that email address? And
please do.
All right. Thank you very much.
Please do. There's one question here.
I wonder if you could talk about something that it's been a couple of years, and I wish I could tell you what the citations were, but I do not remember. But it was someone writing about the implicit, the IAT, the assumption. You know what the test is anyway. IAT. And looking at the impact on communities, the object was to look at police brutality of unarmed black men shooting, and what was found was that it wasn't about the training of individual police officers, but it fits exactly with what you're saying, that those shootings or attacks had to do with the norms of the community, that in communities where we're looking at the aggregate of IAT scores was lower, that there were fewer of those incidents. Where those IAT scores in aggregate were higher, there was more. So it fits exactly with what you're saying, and I wondered if you could talk a bit about that, or what on a civic level, what do communities do to make interventions in the broader community that lead to more inclusivity, less bias?
What communities can do is they can implement pro-diversity initiatives that have been shown to be effective, instead of relying on old, outdated approaches to diversity. It is the case that IAT scores are sometimes related to behavior. It would be incorrect to assume that there is a causal relationship, and I think that mistake was made for a long time. Hey, there's a correlation, but if we then change people's implicit biases, they're going to change their behavior. Well, we now know that that's not the case. It could actually be an outcome, and it actually turns out, as you said precisely, it turns out that if anything, there's just, in particular social settings, certain attitudes are just more prevalent than other attitudes. So what you have in social settings, it's a package of explicit attitudes. It's what newspapers people read. It's what TV news channels they choose to watch. It's what conversations they have in bars, who they talk to about their neighbors, etc. And then what kind of interactions they have, because there is a history of what happened in that particular social context. And if anything, if you really want to know, I think that the IAT and the implicit association test is the result of all that. It's not the cause, it's the result. Because you live in that particular setting and you have all these conversations and you're exposed to yourself to all this particular type of information, as a result, you end up having certain associations. But changing these associations will not change discriminatory behavior. What changes is the setting. We have 2 more questions.
Thanks so much for this. A lot of these interventions seem to change hearts and minds and then behavior. Can you speak to like systematic things, banking and other kinds of systematic behaviors and processes that have embedded bias in them, and how they might be impacted by these kinds of interventions?
Okay. Sometimes we change people's minds to change their behaviors, but sometimes it's not necessary to change people's minds to change their behaviors. These normative interventions actually don't always change people's beliefs about systemic injustice or power hierarchies, and yet we get people to behave more inclusively. So it's not always the case that we first have to change what goes on in people's heads to then change their behaviors. It's also incorrect to assume that as soon as we have changed their mind, they will automatically change their behavior. That's called the value-action gap. Many people have great ideas in their mind, and yet they don't follow through in terms of behavior. So changing people's attitudes, knowledge, awareness is by no means a sufficient cost to then change their behaviors. Then comes the question, at some point, don't we have to talk about systemic injustice in existing power hierarchies? I entirely agree with you, but I'm asking you, when is the best moment to do that? If I start out with that, are the shutters going to go down right there? Can I start out with getting Jeff to behave more inclusively, to be more welcoming and inclusive towards his coworkers who belong to marginalized groups? Maybe to start having a cross-group friendship. And in that, after a while, having conversations with other people that he didn't have before. At some point, Jeff may become interested in finding out a little more about the history of oppression, about what happened in the Great Migration, and how the existing power hierarchies really make it difficult for individuals belonging to certain groups to succeed and to strive. So I do think that at some point, it is good to talk about that and to bring that up. What I'm asking the question is, when's the best moment to bring that up? There's one more question, sorry, and then, sorry, I didn't look. Sorry.
Hi. I have been doing anti-prejudice work for 35 years, and so I have many painful experiences I could share, but I won't. What I would like to know is, I knew nothing about you and your work, and I live in the same city as you, and I'm not an academic. I want to know, what might I read? Where would you point me to get a little more knowledgeable about this?
Okay. It's a very good question. It's a field that's changing rapidly. It's true that those of us who care about rigorously evaluated interventions, currently we focus mostly on doing the research and providing evidence, what works and what doesn't work. I think we haven't done a good enough job to reach out and promote that knowledge. I mean, there are some publications, there are newspaper articles. I've cited some of the newspaper articles I've shown before. It's now becoming better known every day, I would say, what works and what doesn't work. I mean, if you send me an email, I can certainly send you some articles and maybe 2 books that address that. But I'm going to write a book one day, and then in a year from now, and then you will be the first person to know.
So please join me in thanking Professor Bauer for a great conversation. I think he's agreed to stick around for a few more minutes if you feel like you'd like to come up, and then we hope to see you at Crossroads Ideas on March 26th. Thanks so much, everybody.